Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. I'm enjoying my time in the city. I want to talk to you today about a book I wrote here, this one, called When the Rivers Run Dry. I wrote it about 10 years ago, but it's still in print, and we've just done a big revision and lots of new content, so it's pretty up to date now. Anyway, here's the cover. It's about my love of the world's rivers and my journalistic exploration of the world's water supplies, where we get our water from, the problems that we have with it, and why many of our rivers are now in peril. They are literally starting to dry up. Now, for most of us, we don't think much about water. It comes out of a tap, or we drink it from a bottle. But for me, that's the boring bit. My lifelong interest is in flowing water, water moving around the planet, the water cycle, where it comes from, where it goes, how we get our hands on this slippery substance, this remarkably heavy substance, if you think about it. Rivers and the world's waters were the subject of my first book, and my fifth book, and my eighth book, and well, you get the picture. I've been looking at water really all my journalistic life. And nothing is more precious to us than water. Nothing is more essential than water. We need it every day, obviously, but we treat it with disdain, with an extraordinary lack of care, because it is all around us. But now that there are more than 7 billion of us on the planet, we have to change. Water is becoming a precious resource, a limited resource. Now, all over the world, we're damming rivers to try and capture this water, but now there is an opposition movement to dams because of the damage that they do to the natural environment, among other things. And that opposition is especially strong in Europe and North America, where there are calls for a return to wild rivers. We don't have many wild rivers left in the world now. We talk about having wild rainforests or wild ecosystems, but what about wild rivers? So that pushback really began in Europe in the 1990s, and I think I was lucky enough to be there more or less on the very day that in Europe the corner was turned. We stopped building dams and started talking about tearing them down. And it was early one January back in the 1990s when I went to the Auvergne in France, in central France, to a gorge. Here in the picture, high up on France's longest river, the River Loire. And there was a plan to dam this gorge, to fill it with water. But there was an opposition movement to protect what the protesters called the Loire Sauvage, the wild Loire. And I spent the morning in the gorge with this guy in the picture, who was a musician, who gave me a copy of his new album, which was singing all about the river. And we scrambled down into the gorge and filled a bottle of the river's water as a sort of sacred, almost, way of celebrating the river. And in the afternoon, we went to an occupation camp where students all through the winter had stuck it out there, occupying the gorge so that the engineers couldn't move in and start building their dam. And they've been doing this for about 2 years. And then I went into the town to go and buy some campaign buttons. I went to the campaign shop, and I discovered that it was completely by chance. Nobody knew it was going to happen. But the government had unexpectedly announced that it was giving in. The French government wasn't going to allow this dam to be built. And you can imagine, there was great delight, and we celebrated down in the gorge late into the night. There was lots of French wine and cheese and dancing and all sorts of stuff going on, because the river had been saved, and it was a great victory for those local people. But looking back, in retrospect, it was the day that Europeans stopped building new dams. At home, anyway. We still go around the world and build them for other people, but at home we don't. And this politics of dams I've looked at a lot. So, saving rivers excites huge passions that can bring down governments, quite literally. Back in early 1989, when the Berlin Wall was still in place, dividing East and West Europe, I was visiting campaigners in communist Hungary who were trying to prevent the construction of a dam, the Nagymaros Dam, on the river Danube, at a beauty spot, this one, near Budapest, called the Danube Bend. They were going to dam the river there. But there'd been a campaign, like an underground, secret campaign, it started in Hungary to stop this dam. And it was started and run by a biologist, this guy called János Varga. And that year, the reason I went there was because the campaign had broken cover. Politics was changing in Hungary. And their opposition to the dam had become the first open defiance of the Soviet-backed government in Budapest. And it brought tens of thousands of people out onto the streets. This is unheard of in a communist government, protesting against the government of the day. And there was tear gas and there was truncheons, and it was a bit like Hong Kong today. And the people just protested and protested, and they didn't stop. The dam had become a symbol of political opposition to the communist rule. A symbol so powerful that a few weeks after my visit, sadly I wasn't there on the day, it actually brought down the government. The government resigned, a new reformist set of ministers came into power, pledged to cancel the project. This is the reason the government had fallen, because public opposition to the dam. And they did cancel the dam project. And then politics kind of got out of hand. To everyone's amazement, those same politicians suddenly opened the border, the Iron Curtain. They opened it between Hungary and the West. Now this is ancient history to probably most of you, but maybe some of you in the room will remember those days when thousands of East Germans began flooding across into Western Europe. And they went initially through Hungary, because the Berlin Wall was still there. They went into Hungary and then into Austria to get to West Germany. But the Iron Curtain was breached, and within a few weeks the Berlin Wall itself came down. Now we've just been celebrating, just this last week, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. But nobody's mentioned this dam. And I'm not surprised, but I think that's a mistake. Because looking back, it seems to me that it wasn't Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher or Mikhail Gorbachev or any of these leaders who brought down the Berlin Wall. The person who took out the first brick in the wall was this Budapest biologist with his campaign against that dam. He set the political ball rolling. By opposing the dam, he'd opened the political floodgates. So politics of rivers really matters. And I recently went to visit János in Budapest to talk about that. And I suggested to him that he'd had this vital role in one of the greatest political events of Europe in the last half century. And he smiled. He had a little funny smile that I remembered from when I'd met him before, and he remembered the 20 years before. And he said, yeah, I suppose I was right. But he said he hadn't acted out of politics, he had acted to save a river. And that tells me a lot about the power of rivers and the politics of rivers. And we might think about that in the future, I think. But I was talking about wild rivers. One of the things I found extraordinary, excuse me, we lost the picture. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Is that going to move on? Sorry. Thank you, sorry about that. One thing I found extraordinary is how few truly wild rivers there are left in the world. Now, Brazil doesn't do too bad for them, but you're one of the few places that still has wild rivers. Rivers that are undammed, unembanked, are not tapped for their water, they're not tapped for their hydroelectricity, still with their rapids and their deltas and their unruly seasonal floods. And these wild rivers are a living lesson of what most of the world's rivers were like and what's been lost. In particular, they have very large fish stocks. Most dammed rivers have lost most of their fish. One of the most pristine still is the Mekong in Southeast Asia. It still has an annual flood driven by the huge monsoon rains and melting snows that come out of Tibet. Its flow increases 50-fold during the summer flood season. So the water coming down is 50 times as much in the summer flood season. That's an amazing difference. No major river on Earth today has such a variation in flow to the ocean, and that's mainly because they're dammed. So it bursts its banks across a huge floodplain that extends for tens of kilometers. And in front of the royal palace of Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, the water rises 9 meters and pushes up into a tributary river called the Tonle Sap. There is nowhere like it anywhere in the world. The Tonle Sap goes into reverse for more than 100 kilometers for about half the year. It floats uphill, filling a huge lake in the forests of central Cambodia. And these pictures are of floating villages in that lake. I mean, this lake wouldn't be there but for the reverse flow caused by the river Mekong. And this flooded forest is a massive breeding ground for fish. In the silty floodwaters, in among the tree roots, billions of fish fry grow into fat adults. And these floating villages, like this one, the villagers there go around catching them. And this flooded forest is one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. But each November, at the end of the monsoon, as the floods abate, the Tonle Sap, the river that went into reverse, turns and goes back towards the ocean. And the fish swim out, and they swim out into the main Mekong River, and they migrate then for thousands of kilometers up and downstream on the river. There are huge fish in this river. There are carp there that are 3 meters long and will weigh a ton. 2/3 of the fish in the whole of the Mekong, which is a very long river, began their life in this small area, this great lake, at the head of this Tonle Sap, filling nets with fish that feed tens of millions of people across the country. This is a huge national resource created by this river, created by the monsoon flood and the reversal of the river flows. It is, with the possible exception of the Amazon, the most productive inland fishery on the planet. But it's all coming to an end. The Mekong is the latest river where the dam builders have moved. The Chinese in particular, way upstream, the Mekong begins in China, way upstream, they've been tapping the floods with dams to generate hydroelectricity. This is one of them, the Xiaowan Dam. It's the world's tallest dam. It's as high as the Eiffel Tower. Its reservoir is 170 kilometers long. It's holding huge amounts of the Mekong's water. And there are 8 more hydroelectric dams planned for that part of the river. They'll store half the river's entire flow, annual flow. So from now on, the rise and fall of the river is going to be decided not by nature, not by the monsoon floods, but by engineers and the demands for hydroelectricity. And that is likely to end the reverse of the Tonle Sap. It'll end the flooding of the forest, and it will end the fisheries in that river. This is a huge global tragedy happening right now, as important, I think, as what's been happening in the Amazon rainforest, the destruction of one of the world's last great wild rivers. But that brings me on to the Amazon. Is the Amazon River still protected from these changes? After all, it's by far the world's largest river system. It's got 10 times more water flowing down it, even than the Mekong. But even here, the imprints of dams are beginning to be felt on some of its tributaries, not maybe on the main stem, but on some of its tributaries. And we have to remember that some of those tributaries are as big as other countries' major rivers. So the Xingu discharge into the main stem of the Amazon is greater than the discharge of the Mekong into the ocean. Several recent academic papers have picked up on this, the dam building starting on the Amazon, and particularly their impact on the crucial flood pulses, which, like on the Mekong, are vital for the river's natural ecosystems. And they're almost inevitably going to be suppressed by holding back water for hydroelectricity. So hydrologists from the University of Florida in a very recent paper reported on what they called the, quote, the substantial impact of Amazonian dams on flood pulse dynamics. In other words, they're taking away the natural cycling of water in the river. And it's not just the water, it's also the sediment that flows down the rivers and into the floodplains. Things are starting to change on the Amazon. Big dams like the Tucuruí, the Balbina, the reservoir of the Balbina is in that picture, the Manso, the Serra del Mesa, all those dams are starting to have substantial effects. The Tucuruí probably did the least amount of damage for the amount of hydroelectricity produced. But the Balbina is notorious around the world as producing the least amount of hydroelectricity for the most ecological damage. The authors of that paper warned too that the cumulative effect of lots of individual smaller dams is going to be very serious for the whole of the Amazon basin. Some of the worst impacts may be way upstream in the Andes, like the Chinese are damming the Mekong way upstream. Outside Brazil's control, Bolivia and Ecuador, and especially Peru, are now starting to build dams at the top of the Amazon system. There's going to be a mega dam, for instance, in Peru, and a canyon that's often called the gateway between the Andes and the Amazon basin. Here's that gorge that they want to dam. 6 out of 8 Amazon tributary networks in the Andes are already fragmented by dams, and there are many more planned, but this is going to start affecting the river downstream. Especially because more than 90% of the sediment, the silt flow down the Amazon, which keeps it fertile, comes from erosion in the Andes. And hydroelectric dams, well, they hold back their water and then release it through turbines, but the sediment is typically held back. It never leaves the dam, it accumulates slowly on the reservoir bottom. So this sediment is lost to the Amazon for the foreseeable future. And besides upsetting fish migrations, the dams are changing the flood dynamics of the floodplains. The dams are threatening also to starve the river all the way down to the ocean of silt. Now you may think the Amazon is so huge that dams can't matter, but if you have a lot of dams, they certainly can. I would have thought Brazil might be worried about the dams being built by its neighbours upstream. But when I last checked, none of the Amazon nations have ratified the UN Watercourses Convention, which doesn't set rules but sets a framework for countries to sign treaties to manage international rivers like the Amazon. Many countries have done this on international rivers, the Danube and others. But Brazil hasn't signed, and none of its upstream neighbours have signed, so there's no international agreement on managing the Amazon. What is happening on the Mekong and what is starting to happen on the Amazon is only what has already happened on countless rivers around the world. As I said, there are very few wild rivers left. The Columbia River in the American Northwest, for instance, is now barricaded by one of the earliest mega dams, the Grand Coulee hydroelectric dam. It's still the 7th largest hydroelectric dam in the world, and it's built in the 1930s. Back then, people loved dams. Even progressive kind of social activists liked dams. Excuse me. That's Woody Guthrie, folk singer, in the 1930s and 40s, and he sang songs in praise of the Grand Coulee Dam. And he called hydroelectric dams the newest wonders of the world. So back then, in the era of the New Deal, dams were the great new thing. But we now know that the damage they've done downstream is often horrendous. Until the Grand Coulee Dam was built, the River Columbia was one of the world's great salmon rivers, a fantastic global resource. Today, with the dam, the salmon can't migrate. There are very few salmon left. Some environmental economists have calculated the lost value of the salmon every year. And they think that probably they now have a value, if they came back, that would be greater in just in terms of dollars than the electricity generated by the Grand Coulee Dam. So this is not just about nature, this is about economics as well. Hydroelectric dams are often economically a bad idea. They almost always come in over budget and very late, and the dam engineers get rich, but for national economies, hydroelectric dams are often a bad idea. But we don't just dam rivers for hydroelectricity. We dam them probably most of all to get reliable year-round water to irrigate crops in dry parts of the planet. Worldwide, agriculture takes 2/3 of all the water that we abstract from nature, like here in northern Nigeria on the edge of the Sahara. We can grab water and irrigate crops in unlikely places. And feeding us takes a lot of water. Seeing this figure that 2/3 of our water goes to agriculture, I tried to work out, well, how much water do each of us need to feed us? I tried to work out my own water footprint. A lot of people work out their carbon footprint, but what about our water footprint? So I started, on average, I reckon I drink not much more than 5 litres in a day. And even after washing and flushing the toilet, maybe each of us uses about 150 litres in a day. That would be a European average, certainly. But that's just the start. So only when we add in the water that we need to grow what we eat and what we drink that the numbers really begin to soar. And I was amazed at these numbers. It's just a few of them. It takes 1,000 litres of water to grow a kilo of wheat. It takes between 2,000 and 5,000 litres to grow a kilo of rice. So that's more water than many households use in a week, just to irrigate the rice, to grow a bag of rice. And 500 litres for a kilo of potatoes, 11,000 litres to grow a feed for enough cow to make a hamburger. Dairy products are no better, between 2,000 and 4,000 litres for that cow to produce 1 litre of milk. Livestock has a huge water as well as a carbon footprint. These are really high numbers for things that we're consuming every day in our lives. I reckon that as a typical Westerner, a meat-eating, beer-swilling, milk-guzzling Westerner, I got a reasonable-sized water footprint, so I reckon I consume 100 times my own weight in water every day. That's a figure that just amazed me, and I would imagine that you're probably much the same. If you're a vegan, it'll be less, but if you're a vegetarian, consuming dairy products, it'll be much the same. And I consume, over a year, it works out at about the contents of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. The number is 2,500 cubic meters of water I consume, my water footprint, in a year. I'll come back to that number. It matters for a calculation I'll do in a minute. Water used to be thought of as the great unlimited resource on the planet. But the water in our rivers is indeed renewable. It is a renewable resource. The water ultimately gets recycled in the form of sewage from our cities back into the oceans. It then evaporates from the oceans into the air and returns to the earth in new clean rain, and it may be recycled again by the forests. And this natural water cycle is, of course, the basis of all life on earth. We all depend on it. But there is only so much water that runs through this cycle every year. So there's only so much that we can tap. It's a renewable resource, but it's still a limited resource. So how much can we, as a species, take from nature? How much water can we take every year? Well, hydrologists have estimated that for practical purposes and leaving out some remote rivers, with current engineering technology, we can probably tap about, excuse the unit, 9,000 cubic kilometers of river water for our needs. Now, I can't imagine that really, but you can imagine a cubic kilometer is a lot of water, and 9,000 cubic kilometers is a hell of a lot of water. So it's a lot, but if you divide it up between the 7.4 billion people on the planet, if you divide it up, it comes to about 1,200 cubic meters of water a year each, running through the world's water cycle. Now remember, I calculated my own annual water use at about 2,500 cubic meters a year, so that's twice as much. Now, not everybody lives like I do, but I imagine most of the world would like to live as well as me, and as well as you. So, supply from the world's rivers, 1,200 cubic meters a year for each of us. Demand, potentially twice that. The numbers are not quite as simple as that. Not all our water, all our crops are grown from water abstracted from rivers. But you get the sense. It's a very crude calculation, but you get the sense we're coming up against real limits to what until recently seemed an inexhaustible resource. And that, very simply, is why some of the world's greatest rivers are running dry. Rivers like the Indus in Pakistan, the Nile in Egypt, the world's longest river, the Yellow River in China, the Murray River in Australia, even the Rio Grande and the Colorado in the US and Mexico, all are running dry regularly for at least part of the year. No water is getting to the ocean. So if you think about it, the firm blue lines that we see on maps in our atlases are now, well, they're lies really, because they're not blue for much of the year in the real world. They're more yellow. The rivers run dry. And that's hence the title of my book, When the Rivers Run Dry. That's what I'm exploring here. So researching the book, I stood one day on this bridge over the once mighty Rio Grande in El Paso in the US, or on the US-Mexican border. Doesn't look very mighty here. This is where Donald Trump wants to build his wall to keep people from crossing over. Of course, it's a lot easier to cross over when there's no water in the river. I watched the river here for a few minutes from this bridge, And the flow below me along this concrete barbed wire flanked channel wasn't actually flowing towards the ocean. There was a little bit of water, as you can see in the river, but it was actually flowing upstream because of the wind that was blowing it back up. Wind coming all the way from the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing was going down the stream, and this is 300 kilometers from the ocean. I went a bit further downstream and I stood on riverbanks in a small border town called Presidio, where farmers there told me that their fields had been irrigated by that river for more than 400 years, probably longer than anywhere else in the US, but no longer because the river was dry, there was no water. So I met this farmer, a guy called Terry Bishop, who told me he was selling up. His land was right by the Rio Grande, and he had a legal right in American law to take 10 million cubic meters of water a year from that river. That was the theoretical right, but there was no water in the river, so he couldn't take any water, so he couldn't irrigate his fields. His fields were turning into sagebrush. Now that was a decade ago that I visited him. I checked recently for the new book, for the revised book, to find what he was up to. Turned out he didn't sell up in the end, but he'd given up his farming and he was now running a nature reserve on his land, which he irrigated with sewage from a local sewage treatment works, because that was the only water now available in that part of the river. So I guess the good news is he's become a conservationist, but the bad news is the river is still dry. So you won't spot this in any atlases, but the Rio Grande is now 2 rivers. The main arm comes out of the US, it rushes out of the Rockies Mountains, and it gets as far as El Paso, where that bridge was, 1,000 kilometers from the Gulf of Mexico, and it's then dry for 300 kilometers until another side river comes in from Mexico, and that gives it a bit of flow down to the ocean, but Texas farmers often take that out too. So this is not a real river anymore, it's like bits of a river, that's all that's left over. And this is beginning to matter in the American West. They say there now that it wasn't the gun that won the American West, it was water in the desert. But today, water is running out in the West. It's not just the Rio Grande that's drying up. Most of the water that's left there now is underground. They pump it up. Farmers pump it up. Cities like El Paso rely on, well, they actually buy up farmland so they get the water rights to pump the water from beneath. But as a result, the underground water reserves too are disappearing. And this is happening all over the US. Here's a map of one of the world's great aquifers, great underground water reserves, the Ogallala aquifer beneath the high plains. So it stretches all the way from South Dakota down to Texas. It was once, as I say, one of the world's largest underground reserves, but it's now in places close to empty. In some farming areas they're giving up farming, some areas it's just they're pumping from so far down the water is contaminated and it's bad water they're finding. So even in America they're running out of water. America is not alone in mining underground water now as rivers run dry. More and more the world depends on underground water. But often underground water that is not being replaced by the rains. So that's like a long-term problem, because underground water is not necessarily a renewable resource like rivers. And this is happening in India in a big way. I went to explore the consequences, which could be really serious. Now, India relies on irrigation an awful lot. A century ago, British colonial engineers built the largest network of irrigation canals in the world. It still is, to divert river water to grow food and cotton, then for the British Empire. Now, today, those fields feed 1 billion Indians. But there is no water for much of the year in many of the canals that tap the rivers, because the rivers are running dry for much of the year. All the water is taken. Virtually the only water in India outside the short monsoon season is underground. So they're pumping. Pumping and pumping. Tens of millions of Indian farmers are now irrigating their crops with underground water. They never used to do it, or rarely, not for irrigation. More than 20 million Indian farmers are doing this. They're buying cheap pumps to bring this water to the surface for their crops. And thanks to this, it's a success story in a way, because 40 years ago, India was still a place that we associated with famine. Today we don't. India feeds itself. It has water, it has food left for export some years, and that's great. But it is coming at a huge cost for the future, because they are mining water on a vast scale. And you can see this in many places across the countryside. Hundreds of these ancient step wells that people used to use to collect water for their households. Till recently, you could have walked down those steps. This is one in Gujarat in western India, and gather water just with a bucket, just on the end of a piece of string. But now that well is dry right to the bottom, several tens of meters down. And in fact, the water table there is half a kilometre down. So water that you used to be able to find within a few meters of the surface is now you have to go half a kilometre down. And of course use electric pumps. They've done the statistics of the hydrologists there. Across India, farmers are taking from underground 100 cubic kilometres more water every year than the rains replace. They're pumping up twice as much water as goes underground as a result of rain. It's a hydrological anarchy. The water tables are going down and down and down. They're pumping more and more and more, and it can't go on. India is living on borrowed water and borrowed time as regards feeding itself. And there are other countries like that, but India is one of the biggest with one of the scariest problems. Large areas of the planet have been dried up. Not by climate change. We often say all the water problems are caused by climate change, but more often locally they're due to over-abstracting of water, just taking too much. New deserts are being created, quite literally. I went to Central Asia. I went in search of, you may know this story, I went in search of the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan. Until half a century ago, the Aral Sea was the 4th largest inland sea in the world. I went in search of it, but I never found it. Here's a map, some maps of what's happened to it. It has simply disappeared. This is a map I found at a local museum, and it shows from 1960 through to 2009 how the Aral Sea disappeared. The reason is cotton. Uzbekistan is one of the world's largest producers of cotton. The Russians in the 1960s and 1970s created a vast network of irrigation canals to grow cotton in what amounts to desert. So for the past 50 years, almost the entire flow of the two great rivers that used to supply and keep the Aral Sea full, almost their entire flow has been diverted to the cotton fields. These were rivers that used to be the size of the Nile. They're not small rivers. And so without that inflow, this inland sea has simply been evaporating in the sun. And you can see the result here. I went to a town called Mainak, which you can see in the first, well, you can see on the southern shore of what was the sea. It was a seaside resort, and it had a fishing port. Trawlers went out into the sea and they brought back vast amounts of fish. But no longer. There are no fish, there is no trawling, the fish canning plants are all shut, and so on. I met some of these guys, just kids, on the shore. You can see one of the abandoned trawlers. In the old days, they'd probably grown up to be trawlermen, or they'd gone to work in the canning factory. But the canning factory is now abandoned. It's still there, and these are the old Soviet-era murals of fishermen with great catches of fish from the Aral Sea, but that's all gone now. I walked out from the seafront, and we walked, and when we drove, and then we walked across the old seabed. And it was sand, and it was sand, and it was sand. It's the whole new desert that's being created out there where the sea once was. The sea, I couldn't see it, but they told me, and you can see from the map, it was 100 kilometers away. So the sea has retreated 100 kilometers in the last 50 years because all the water has been taken. It's just a few very salty sub pools left in the desert, an entirely unmapped and largely unvisited desert. If you want to go anywhere in the world that people haven't been to before, haven't walked before, don't go to the Amazon, go to the desert that used to be the Aral Sea. You can walk places where nobody has set foot. Just take a map with you and you'll find your way. The UN calls the death of the Aral Sea the greatest environmental disaster of the 20th century, and I'm inclined to believe it's as great as what's happening in the Amazon. But it's a terrible human tragedy as well, because the salt from that sea and the agricultural chemicals that used to come down the rivers get whipped up in sandstorms that blow off the dried up seabed. And they're poisoning, that salt and the chemicals are poisoning everything everywhere. It's in the water, it's in the food, it's in the air, and of course it's in the people. I visited one of the local doctors there who's campaigned about this, Oral Ataniazova. And she told me that the life expectancy in the area around the dried up seabed is now just 51 years. Most Africans do better than that. This is a really sick area because of the chemicals and the salt. 97% of the women, Oral told me, are anemic. Children are malnourished on a large scale. This kid is 4 years old. You might not guess it. There's a picture taken in the hospital. 1 in every 20 babies is born deformed because of this contamination. In some villages, they told me the mother's milk is so salty that babies won't suckle. That's the extent to which salt has kind of poisoned their world. I talked about all this with a group of farmers who told me how the salt was killing their families. You can see it in the faces of everyone living here, is what the manager, the guy standing up, manager of a state farm, told me. We're all affected, he said. All the women are sick, and it's worst in pregnancy. Lots of people die, especially the children. So this has happened because we've taken all the water out of the rivers. And it's still going on. Soon after, I first went to the Aral Sea soon after the Soviet Union collapsed. I went to a conference where leaders of the newly independent republics of Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and the others promised to bring back the Aral Sea. They were lying, because since then the sea has emptied yet further, because they didn't stop the cotton farming, they didn't stop the irrigation. The new capitalist rulers of Uzbekistan and its neighbours have become personally now fabulously rich, selling cotton to the world. Now don't do this now necessarily, but check your clothes later. Look at the label on your cotton clothing. If the label says made in Bangladesh, which it may well, the cotton most likely came from emptying the Aral Sea. Bangladesh textile mills relied on Aral Sea cotton. But it's part of my water footprint too. I've probably got made in Bangladesh clothes on me today. Now that was the worst, the Aral Sea. I've never seen anything as bad as that. But I've found many more tragedies happening because of our rampant misuse of water all around the world. Nobody seems any good at it. In northern Nigeria, I visited the inhabitants of the Hadejia Nguru wetland, which is a large oasis on the edge of the Sahara, They get fish there, and they herd cattle on their flooded pastures, and they gather reeds, which is what these guys are doing here, and they irrigate a few crops. There's a traditional system of using the wetland to make livelihoods. But the water is being taken away now by this irrigation project, which is taking water from the river, taking it from the wetland, to feed a government irrigation project near the big city of Kano. It's a very inefficient irrigation project. It's a government scheme that doesn't work very well, but it still takes the water. The government said this, the Nigerian government said the project would, quote, green the desert, but in fact it's creating desert by drying up that wetland that we saw. Again, examples of really bad use of water around the world. Water is about power. People who can grab hold of water can make money, and the people without power are often the people who are left without water. But it's not just about the quantity of water. Sometimes it's about the quality as well. One of my most harrowing journeys was to Bangladesh. Back in the 1980s, doctors decided that the surface water in this extremely wet country, it's like a whole delta region, that the water at the surface was getting too polluted and people were getting sick with diarrhea, and that's true. There was a big public health problem. So they proposed instead sinking millions of wells, tube wells, into underground, to tap underground water. Simple tube wells in the backyard of most houses like this one. When they first suggested it, some of the old-timers warned that it was a bad idea. The old men said, and the old women said, that the underground water was the devil's water. They didn't quite know why they called it the devil's water, but they said that's what it was called. But the aid agencies, UNICEF and the others, didn't take any notice of that, and they began drilling. And within a decade, there were some 10 million of these tube wells sunk across the southern half of Bangladesh. And most people drank the underground water. And then strange cases of blotched skin started turning up. Strange lesions on skin. Cancers began to emerge. And it kind of became an epidemic. And finally, someone tested the water. 10 million tube wells, nobody tested the water. And they found that much of it contained arsenic at concentrations hundreds of times greater than the accepted safe levels. And naturally, it was natural arsenic, it's not industrial poisoning or anything, but it had dissolved in the muds in the local river deltas over probably millions of years. But now tens of millions of people were drinking that poisoned water. So perhaps that's why the old guys said that it was the devil's water. So I went out with screening teams to villages to find out the quality of the water in individual tube wells. And we chose one called Dipodi, more or less at random. I went out with a public health professional. And we went there, and the villagers there said that nobody had previously tested their water. They had no idea if it was safe or not. So we did some testing. The guy was with us, the guy in the pink shirt there. And he got people to bring water from their tube wells. They had 9 wells in the village. And he tested them, simple tests, and they all gathered round to hear what the results were. And one of them was off the scale. 50 times the World Health Organization's recommended arsenic level. And then he asked them to take off their shirts, or the men anyway, to take off their shirts to check for signs of poisoning. And the symptoms were starting to show. They'd had these tube wells in that village for 7 years, and the new water was starting to produce symptoms. So before we left, he just painted the poisoned wells, poisoned parts he painted red, and the clean ones he painted green, so that everybody in future would know which of the safe ones were. But it was too late for one man. I apologise slightly for this photograph, but it does tell a story. It was too late for one man that we met in the next village. He had this gruesome kind of carcinoma growth on one hand. And he showed us this, and in the other hand he had a bottle of water. And he said, "Will you test my water for me?" And we couldn't do it instantly, but we took the water away, and I checked on the results later, and sure enough, the lab analysis confirmed that his water that he drank every day was lethal. And nobody can say it caused that carcinoma, but it seems quite likely. Now all this I was researching about a decade ago. The World Health Organization at the time called this epidemic, quote, "the worst mass poisoning of a population in history." It took it seriously. You might think that the problem might have been fixed by now, but no. The allocation of replacement wells has been handled very badly. And there is clean water down there if you go to the right level. It depends what level you pump from. So it's possible to provide people with clean water. But the replacement wells have been handled very badly. There's been a lot of corruption. And the people from the World Health Organization said that probably as many people are at risk today as they were when the epidemic was first discovered. So yeah, I think the old timers were right to warn about the devil's water. And that's one of the things I learned. This is my last point really. One of the things I learned is that often the ancients, the old wise tales, the old folk tales that people tell about water contain a lot of truth. Modern scientists tend to dismiss folk knowledge, and let me come back to some good news. I've given you a lot of bad news, but some good news. The good news is some of the most inspiring things that I've seen on my journeys looking at water around the world have been efforts by people to go almost back in time to look for old solutions to water problems. And they're discovering that we often used to manage water rather better than we do today. Here's one small place where I found that. It's in arid northern Syria. I went there just before the Civil War. I probably couldn't go there now. And I saw farmers in arid regions who maintained underground tunnels which collected water from beneath the hills. It was an arid landscape with no rivers on the surface, but there was water underground. And they built these tunnels which flow by gravity, and they call them canals. And there are lots of them around the countryside if you look, and they're built with extraordinary skill on a simple shallow grading into the hills to find where the underground water is. And this village, it's a very small channel as you can see, but that water was running constantly. This village is still inhabited by the descendants of the one man who found the water there in the hill just behind them a century ago. And it still delivers water down that tunnel and into this tank. Not a big tank, but it is enough water to irrigate several fields, the fields that those villagers rely on. So it's a lifeline in the desert, and the only reason why that village is there. Some people say that the civil war in Syria over the last 10 years was caused by people leaving these rural dry areas because of drought and going to the cities, and the sort of civil disturbances that followed. Well, the drought was real, but in villages like this, where they could tap underground water, they didn't. They could stay because they could still grow crops. So you might argue that if the canals, many of which are now out of use, if these tunnels had been kept in use, there might not have been a civil war in Syria. I don't say that for sure, but it's something worth thinking about. But as I say, these tunnels are found all over the Middle East and beyond. In Iran, which is where they were first developed, some of them are several kilometers long. Some of them are as wide, so wide that you could ride a horse through. They're really big civil engineering structures. I went to Oman, where the government is reviving them. Most places they're in decline, people are just using pumped water, but in Oman, the government is reviving them, and that's the channels, concrete channels that take water from beneath the hills behind. And they're using them to irrigate their date palms. So they're keeping rural life going in Oman, which is in the Arabian desert. There are many other old technologies that are being revived. These ones are perhaps local to particular environments, but in India, as the rivers run dry, as we saw earlier, and as the underground water diminishes, many villages are relearning old methods of catching the monsoon rains as they fall onto their fields. Western engineers said that the thing to do was to build dams, and you wait for the water to run off into the rivers and you catch it behind the dams, and then you can pump it around the country. For many of these villages, the water from the dams never reached them, so they're setting up their own system. So they're doing the traditional way. They're constructing low walls across their land, across the fields, to hold back the rain as it falls, and divert it sometimes into ponds and sometimes underground, where it won't evaporate, to recharge their underground water supplies. And I went to quite a few villages in Gujarat where this is going on. This is one village. The technique has been pioneered by lots of social activists. They're looking back to traditional ways before the British were there. So disciples of Mahatma Gandhi, some Hindu religious groups, are all promoting this idea. And this guy is a retired policeman from this village, and he's doing the same thing. So he's not part of any group, he just thinks it's a good idea, it'll make his village richer, and he's been proved right. He and his fellow villagers created that large lake that you can see behind him, and the lake waters their crops. The lake wasn't there before they started holding back the monsoon rains. They used to get one harvest a year from their fields, just during the monsoon. Now they can plant crops all through the year. They told me they get 3 harvests. But neighbouring villages that haven't done what they have still only get 1 crop. And those neighbouring villages often rely on government tankers just to provide them with drinking water during the long dry season. But not here. The policeman told me we haven't had a water tanker come to our village for more than 10 years. There is no more rain than before, he told me. We just use it better. We don't let it wash away. So these guys have been using old techniques, but they're being real smart. We need to think about that, I think. Some Western methods of supplying water in arid regions really don't work very well. A lot of the water evaporates away. It never gets to the people who want it. The people who control the dams control who gets the water, and that often means that the poorest, the most thirsty don't get it. So this is about ecology, but also about politics and about access to water. But it seems to me that I'm finishing here, there's a key lesson that we must learn about cherishing our water and using it wisely. We may sometimes need modern technology. I'm not saying that we should scrap all the dams, but we need a kind of new water ethic. Water may be recycled by nature, but it's also in a closed loop. There will never be more of it on our planet than there is. There will also never be less of it, but we have to manage it. In a planet with 7 billion people, with rising needs for water for all sorts of things, we've just got to use it more sensibly. We've got to waste less. We can all do it in our daily lives. We know how we waste water. But as a society, we need to do it better. We need to stop thinking about water as something that's always there and always freely available, and when it rains, so that's fine. Water is becoming a critical resource in the modern world. And I think one of the, almost as much as climate change, is the challenge for the 21st century. The good news, well, the bad news is we use water so wastefully today. The good news is if we waste so much of it, we could do it so much better. We've just got to learn how to do it. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.